A millionaire marries an unattractive beggar for a bet, but what he discovers on their wedding night shocks him. Before we dive into the story, share in the comments where you're watching from and enjoy the tale. Billy Gate, a cold and confident millionaire, radiated arrogance as he stood on the balcony of a lavish party. Nothing seemed to faze his demeanor until an old friend, Oliver Jones, approached with a glass of wine in hand and a provocative smile. "Billy, you're always saying money can buy anything, right?" Oliver said, breaking the silence. Billy took a sip of his champagne, his expression indifferent. "Because it can." Oliver leaned against the balcony railing and pointed toward a figure sitting on the sidewalk below. It was a young woman, barefoot, wearing worn-out clothes, with a weary gaze. "See her?" Oliver said, his tone challenging. "She's your next challenge. I bet $2 million you can't turn her into a high-society lady and stay married to her for 3 months." Billy narrowed his eyes, locking onto the young woman for a moment. He didn't see a person, just a pawn in a game he was confident he could win. "$2 million?" he asked, a cynical smile forming. "You clearly underestimate my abilities." "Let's see then." Oliver raised his glass in a toast, his look daring Billy. Billy remained silent, staring at the scene below. The young woman seemed entirely oblivious to the world around her, with a small plastic cup at her side where a few coins occasionally clinked. "Looks like tonight's entertainment has begun," Billy murmured before turning and heading back inside. Minutes later, he was standing on the sidewalk, just steps away from the young woman. As he approached, her hunched figure under the dim yellow glow of a streetlight became clearer. Her disheveled hair framed a face marked by exhaustion, yet there was a silent strength in her that intrigued him. Her thin hands held a piece of cardboard with crooked writing. "Anything helps." "Excuse me," Billy said, his tone more command than request. The woman looked up, startled. Her blue eyes, dulled by hardship, revealed a latent strength Billy hadn't expected. "What do you want?" she asked, weary, shrinking further into herself. Billy offered a smile that blended condescension and curiosity. "I have a proposition for you, something that could change your life." She frowned, suspicious, but said nothing. "I'm serious," he continued, kneeling to meet her eye level. "My name is Gate. I have money, a lot of it, and I need someone like you for a personal project." The woman laughed bitterly, her worn teeth showing. "I'm not anyone's guinea pig, Mr. Millionaire." Billy ignored her sharp tone and pressed on with cold precision. "I'm willing to pay generously. You'll have food, clothes, and a place to stay. All you need to do is marry me for 3 months." The woman blinked, incredulous. "You must be joking." "I don't joke about business," Billy replied firmly. "It's simple, a marriage of convenience, no real commitment. After 3 months, we part ways, and you walk away with more money than you've ever imagined." She sat in silence for a few moments, processing the absurd proposal. Her life had been a string of downward spirals since losing everything, yet something about Billy's authoritative tone irritated her deeply. "Why me?" she finally asked. "Because you're here," he replied bluntly. Billy's cynical response nearly made her stand and walk away, but the weight of hunger and cold kept her rooted in place. "My name is Vicky Wool," she said softly. "And if I agree, how do I know this isn't some sort of scam?" Billy pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Moments later, a sleek black car pulled up beside them. A sharply dressed driver stepped out and opened the back door. "Get in," Billy ordered. "We'll talk somewhere more comfortable." Vicky hesitated, but the temptation to escape the street, even for a few hours, was too strong. She climbed into the car and Billy followed, instructing the driver to take them to the nearest hotel. The silence during the ride was almost unbearable. Vicky watched the city pass by through the window, while Billy, indifferent, typed something on his phone. When they arrived at the hotel, they were escorted to a luxurious suite. Vicky could barely hide her astonishment. Plush carpets, refined wooden furniture, and a stunning view of the city created a scene she never could have imagined. Billy ordered room service to bring food and clean clothes. Vicky, still wary, stayed near the door, watching his every move. "Relax," Billy said, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "I have no interest in hurting you." This is just part of a deal. A few minutes later, the food arrived, and Vicky ate without hesitation, feeling her stomach finally settle. Billy observed her intently, analyzing her every gesture. "So, do you agree or not?" he asked once she finished eating. Vicky wiped her mouth with a napkin and took a deep breath. "How much are you paying me?" $1 million, Billy replied, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Vicky nearly choked. The amount seemed unreal. With that kind of money, she could start over, maybe even help others like her. But the thought of compromising her dignity was unsettling. "I need some guarantees," she said, trying to regain control of the conversation. Billy nodded. "Everything will be in writing. My lawyer will draft a contract. You'll have food, clothes, a room at my mansion, and the weddings." "Tomorrow," Billy replied bluntly. "It'll be quick, just a formality." Vicky ran her hand through her hair, feeling cornered. Billy's words sounded final, leaving no room for negotiation. At last, she sighed and nodded. "All right." Billy stood, satisfied. "Excellent. Rest tonight. Tomorrow marks the first day of the rest of our lives." Vicky watched him leave the suite, leaving her alone in the luxurious room. The silence that followed was almost deafening. She knew she had made a risky decision, but at the same time, she felt like she had no other choice. The next morning, Vicky was awakened by a soft knock on the door. The hotel housekeeper entered with a breakfast tray and neatly folded new clothes. Vicky noticed the care in every detail, fine fabrics, neutral colors, all perfectly tailored to her size. As she ate, the weight of her decision sank in. She was selling 3 months of her life, but the promise of $1 million made her head spin. Starting over no longer felt like a distant dream. Shortly after, Billy appeared as polished as ever, holding a. Billy handed Vicky a leather folder. "Here's the contract. Read it, sign it, and we'll meet at the courthouse at 2 o'clock. Vicky flipped through the document, her eyes scanning the clauses and terms outlining every detail of the agreement. Everything seemed legitimate, but the formality felt unsettling. Still, she signed, feeling like each stroke of the pen marked a point of no return. The wedding was quick and emotionless, just a few words exchanged in front of an impersonal judge, a few signatures, and it was done. Vicky Wool was now officially Vicky Gate, Billy Parker's wife. There were no guests, just the driver and the lawyer as witnesses. As they left the courthouse, Billy placed a hand on the small of Vicky's back, guiding her to the car. She noticed he did it not with affection, but with mechanical precision, as if fulfilling a protocol. "And now," she asked as the car moved through the busy streets. "Now we go to my mansion. That's where you'll be staying for the next few months," Billy said, not looking up from his phone. The Gate mansion was as grand as Vicky had imagined. Tall wrought iron gates opened automatically, revealing a long driveway lined with perfectly manicured gardens. The house itself was massive, with white columns and large windows reflecting the sky. Inside, Vicky was greeted by a team of staff. Billy gave quick instructions, telling them to prepare a room for his new wife. Meanwhile, Vicky remained silent, trying to take in her surroundings. By nightfall, Billy invited her to dinner. The dining room was enormous, with a long table illuminated by a crystal chandelier. Vicky sat at one end, and Billy at the other. The distance between them felt symbolic, but Billy, indifferent, simply began eating. "How are you settling in?" he asked in an almost casual tone. "I'm not used to this much luxury," Vicky admitted, glancing around. Billy allowed a faint smile. "You'll get used to it." After dinner, Billy walked to the room prepared for her. In the hallway, their voices echoed softly until Vicky stopped and turned to him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, finally voicing the question that had been haunting her. Billy crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. "Because I can." Vicky narrowed her eyes, feeling a mix of anger and curiosity. "This isn't random. People like you don't do things like this without a reason." Billy didn't answer. He simply gave a faint smile and stepped away. "Get some rest. Tomorrow your transformation begins." Later that night, Vicky sat alone in her room, perched on the edge of the bed. Memories from her past began to resurface. It wasn't just the grandeur of the mansion that unsettled her. There was something deeper. She realized she had crossed paths with Billy before. Suddenly, a memory flashed in her mind. Years ago, sitting nervously in an interview room, she had dressed in her best outfit and clutched a meticulously prepared resume. The company was Gate Enterprises, and the interviewer was Billy Gates. She recalled Billy's cold gaze as he dismissed her with a harsh comment, "We don't waste time on amateurs." That humiliation had shattered her confidence, and her life had unraveled afterward. Now, ironically, she was married to the man who had triggered her downfall. Anger boiled inside her. How could he not remember her? Or did he remember and simply not care? Determined, Vicky left her room and went to the study, where she found Billy reviewing documents. "I need to ask you something," she said, crossing her arms. Billy looked up, surprised by the interruption. "What is it?" "Do you really not remember me?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. Billy frowned, puzzled. "Should I?" Vicky clenched her fists, fighting back tears. "A few years ago, I came to your company looking for a job. You humiliated me in front of everyone." Billy studied her for a moment, as if trying to recall. Finally, he shrugged. "I interviewed dozens of people every month. I don't remember all of them." His indifference cut like a knife. "Of course you don't," she replied bitterly. "To you, we're all disposable." Billy remained silent, but something in Vicky's expression unsettled him. He stood and took a step toward her, but she was already walking away, returning to her room. Alone again, Vicky felt the weight of the situation. This wasn't just a cold arrangement. It was a chance to face the man who had once destroyed her. But she was no longer the vulnerable young woman from years ago. The next morning, Vicky awoke with the first rays of sunlight streaming through the massive windows. The weight of last night's conversation lingered, but she resolved not to let it consume her. She got up, took a shower, and went downstairs for breakfast, where she found Billy already seated, reading a newspaper. "Good morning," she said in a neutral tone. Billy nodded, his eyes still on the paper. The silence between them was heavy, but Vicky refused to be intimidated. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the table. "So, what's next?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. Billy lowered the newspaper and looked at her with a faint smile. "Now your transformation begins. We have a team of stylists, etiquette instructors, and even a posture coach. Soon, you'll be introduced to high society as my wife." Vicky rolled her eyes. "As if expensive clothes will erase everything I've been through." Billy ignored the remark. "Next week's business dinner will be your first test. I need you to be flawless." The following days were grueling for Vicky. From early mornings, she endured endless clothing fittings, etiquette lessons, and posture drills. Though she despised the superficiality of it all, she began to notice herself adapting to the new environment. Billy, meanwhile, kept his distance, but couldn't ignore the impact Vicky was having on the household. She wasn't like the other women he had known. She didn't bow to his authority. One afternoon, as Vicky practiced walking gracefully across the grand hall, Billy entered and watched in silence. When she noticed him, she stopped and crossed her arms. "Enjoying the show?" she asked with sarcasm. Billy gave a small smile. "Just assessing your progress." "You're doing well." Vicky scoffed. "Glad my performance meets your approval, Mr. Gate." Billy stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away. "Why does it always feel like you're ready to attack me?" "Maybe because you deserve it," she replied without hesitation. Billy paused, surprised by her honesty. Then he took a step back and changed the subject. "Get ready. We're going out tonight." "Where?" Vicky asked suspiciously. "A private dinner at a restaurant. I want to see how you handle yourself in public." Later that evening, Billy and Vicky arrived at one of the most upscale restaurants in the city. Vicky, wearing an elegant dress, drew admiring glances but felt uncomfortable under the attention. Billy, however, appeared completely at ease. During dinner, Billy noticed that Vicky was nervous. Her gaze shifted frequently, and she fidgeted with the strap of her dress. "Relax," he said in a low voice. "You're doing a great job." Vicky looked up, surprised by his encouraging tone. I'm not used to any of this. Billy leaned forward slightly. You'll adapt. Trust me. For a moment, Vicky saw something different in his eyes. He wasn't the cold, calculating man she'd met before. There was something more human, almost vulnerable. After dinner, on the ride back to the mansion, the atmosphere in the car was lighter. Billy commented on her behavior during dinner, pointing out small improvements she could make, but without his usual critical tone. You're really taking this seriously, aren't you? Vicky asked. Billy glanced at her from the corner of his eye. I always take my bets seriously, he replied. The mention of a bet made Vicky tense. She still didn't know exactly what Billy stood to gain from all this, but the idea of being just a pawn in some game left a bitter taste in her mouth. Later that night, while alone in her room, Vicky decided to explore the mansion. She wandered through the quiet hallways until she came across a slightly open door leading to an office. Inside, a massive wooden desk was covered with documents and papers. Curiously, Vicky approached and began sifting through the papers. Among contracts and financial reports, she found something that made her blood run cold, a printed conversation between Billy and another man, discussing the details of the bet. Has she agreed? One message read. Yes, it's only a matter of time before I win, Billy's reply stated, his words dripping with indifference. Vicky felt her stomach churn. She had known there was more to Billy's actions, but seeing the words in black and white made it all the more painful. Suddenly, the door opened and Billy walked in. When he saw Vicky holding the papers, his expression hardened. What are you doing in here? He asked, his voice low and tense. Vicky stared at him, clutching the papers tightly. Is this how you see me? Just a bet to feed your ego? Billy stepped closer, trying to take the papers, but Vicky pulled back. Answer me, she demanded, her voice trembling with anger. Billy sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's not as simple as it seems. Not simple. Vicky let out a bitter laugh. You've toyed with my life like I'm some disposable object. Vicky, Billy began, but she cut him off. Don't you dare try to justify this, she shouted, throwing the papers onto the desk before storming out of the office. Billy stood alone, staring at the scattered papers. For the first time in years, he felt as though he'd lost control. Vicky could barely breathe as she rushed up the stairs, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from her chest. Once inside her room, she locked the door and leaned against it, trying to calm herself. Discovering the bet had shattered any tolerance she had built over the past few days. I can't stay here, she thought, tears of anger and humiliation streaming down her face. Desperately, she searched her room for anything that could help her escape. That night, while everyone slept, Vicky put her plan into action. She dressed in simple clothes and packed a small bag with the few belongings she'd gathered since arriving at the mansion. Carefully, she opened the window, trying not to make a sound, and climbed down the trellis that held the mansion's rose vines. The cold night air enveloped her as she finally reached the ground. Looking back at the mansion's imposing silhouette against the night sky, part of her wanted to scream, to make Billy feel the pain she carried. But instead, she turned and ran toward the road, without looking back. The streets were empty, and she walked aimlessly for hours, ignoring the exhaustion and the biting cold against her skin. When she finally reached the city center, she found shelter in a subway station, curled up on a bench, trying to sleep. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Billy woke early and noticed Vicky's absence at breakfast. At first, he wasn't concerned, thinking she just needed space after the argument the night before. But when one of the staff mentioned they hadn't seen her since dinner, Billy felt a chill run down his spine. Check her room, he ordered, trying to stay calm. A few minutes later, the butler returned with a worried expression. Mr. Gate, the room is empty and the window is open. Billy immediately ran upstairs and entered Vicky's room. The bed was untouched, and her clothes still hung in the closet. He walked to the window and saw marks on the trellis. She ran away, he murmured, clenching his fists. Without wasting time, Billy grabbed his phone and made several calls, reaching out to his contacts to try to find her. The thought of Vicky wandering the streets alone unsettled him. He couldn't explain it, but something inside him was driving him to find her. Not because of the bet, but because of something new growing in his heart: regret. Meanwhile, Vicky wandered aimlessly, struggling to stay on her feet. Her strength was fading, and her fever was rising. The exhaustion of the past few days was catching up with her, but she refused to stop. Every step she took was a statement of her resilience, a proof that she wouldn't let Billy, or any other man, control her again. At dawn, she reached a small square and sat on a wooden bench. Her hands trembled, and her vision blurred. She knew she needed help, but her pride kept her from asking. Closing her eyes, she felt her body give in to exhaustion. Billy, on the other hand, had already started searching the city streets. Driving his own car, he scanned every corner, every bench, looking for any sign of Vicky. Guilt consumed him. He had never imagined his actions could cause so much pain. Hours later, with the sun high in the sky, he finally found her. Vicky was lying on a bench, curled up under a thin blanket someone had likely given her. Her face was pale, and she was trembling with fever. "Vicky!" Billy called out, running toward her. She slowly opened her eyes, her unfocused gaze meeting his. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here to take you home," he said, his voice firm but full of concern. "I don't have a home," she replied bitterly. Billy picked her up, ignoring her weak attempts to resist, and carried her to the car. On the way to the hospital, he remained silent, his thoughts a whirlwind. He knew he'd need more than words to regain Vicky's trust. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed that Vicky was dehydrated and running a high fever. Billy stayed by her side, watching her sleep as the medical staff cared for her. A heavy weight pressed on his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't in control of his own life. Hours later, when Vicky finally woke up, she found Billy sitting by her bed. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were fixed on her. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice still weak. "Because I care," Billy answered sincerely. Vicky let out a faint laugh, her voice a mere whisper. "You don't know what it means to care about anyone but yourself." Billy lowered his head, his hands gripping his knees. "Maybe you're right, but I'm trying to change." She watched him silently, unsure whether to believe him. Her mind was too tired to process his words. The next morning, Vicky woke to the soft sound of footsteps entering the room. Still weak, she turned her head slowly and saw a nurse adjusting her for. The sight was comforting but also a stark reminder of her vulnerability. Billy was nowhere to be seen, allowing her to relax a bit more. Not long after, the door opened and Billy walked in, carrying a small paper bag. He was dressed casually, a rare sight, given his usual formal attire. His eyes showed fatigue but also determination. "I brought something for you," he said, placing the bag on the bedside table. Vicky simply watched him, without speaking. Billy pulled up a chair and sat down, keeping a respectful distance. "It's soup," he said. Billy carefully opened a small paper bag and said, "I brought something for you." "It's soup. You need to regain your strength." "I don't want anything from you," Vicky replied, her voice hoarse and cold. Billy sighed but didn't push. He knew that forcing her now would be pointless. Instead, he stayed seated, letting the silence linger between them. "Why are you here?" Vicky finally asked, breaking the quiet. He hesitated before answering. "Because I care." Vicky let out a bitter laugh. "You don't know what that means." Billy leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I've spent my whole life not truly caring about anyone, but you made me see things I never wanted to face." She looked away, gripping the bedsheet. "That doesn't change what you did." "I know," he said, his voice heavy. "And I don't expect you to forgive me anytime soon, but I'll prove that I can be different." Vicky remained silent, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She wanted to believe him, but the wounds were still too fresh. In the days that followed, Billy stayed by Vicky's side, making sure she received the best care. He coordinated with the doctors, made sure the food was to her liking, and even brought her books to help pass the time. Although Vicky was still resentful, she couldn't ignore his efforts. One afternoon, as she flipped through one of the books Billy had brought, she found something unexpected, a carefully folded letter tucked between the pages. It was handwritten in Billy's firm script. "Vicky, I know words aren't enough to undo what I've done, but I need you to know I'm trying. I've never been someone who admits mistakes, but you've made me look in the mirror and see who I really am. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I want to become someone worthy of your respect." Vicky read the letter over and over, trying to decipher its true intentions. Was there sincerity in those words, or was this just another attempt to manipulate her? That night, when Billy walked into the room, Vicky held the letter up to him. "What is this?" she asked, her voice firm. Billy glanced at the letter inside. "It's my attempt to be honest." Vicky shook her head. "You used me. Humiliated me. How can I believe anything you say?" Billy stepped closer, but kept a respectful distance. "I know I have no right to ask for your trust, but I'm here, and I'll stay here even if it takes years for you to believe in me." Tears filled Vicky's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you." Billy nodded slowly. "I understand." The next day, the doctors informed Vicky that she was well enough to leave the hospital. Billy wasted no time arranging everything to bring her back to the mansion. Vicky, though reluctant, knew she had nowhere else to go. When they arrived at the mansion, Billy surprised her with something she never expected. He had transformed one of the rooms into a small art studio, complete with canvases, brushes, and paints in every color. "What is this?" she asked, stunned. "You mentioned once that you liked painting," Billy said with a shy smile. "I thought you might like a space of your own." Vicky was speechless. It was a simple gesture, but one filled with meaning. For the first time, she saw something in Billy beyond the arrogant billionaire. In the days that followed, Vicky spent more time in the studio, exploring her creativity. Painting gave her a sense of freedom, something she hadn't felt in years. Billy, for his part, kept his distance, respecting her space while quietly ensuring her comfort. One afternoon, as Vicky painted, Billy appeared in the doorway, watching her in silence. "You're talented," he said at last. Vicky paused and looked at him. "I didn't know you had an eye for art." Billy shrugged, a faint smile on his lips. "I'm learning." Vicky laughed, for the first time in what felt like forever. The days at the mansion settled into a calmer rhythm. Vicky spent most of her time in the art studio, while Billy focused on his business affairs. There was a sort of truce between them, a fragile balance neither dared to disturb. But Billy wasn't satisfied. He knew words alone wouldn't be enough to rebuild Vicky's trust. He needed to take action, to prove he was willing to change, not just for her but for himself. One afternoon, Billy entered the studio while Vicky was focused on a new painting. He waited for her to notice him, but she kept working, deliberately ignoring him. "I need your help," he said, finally breaking the silence. Vicky stopped and wiped her hands on a cloth. "My help?" Billy nodded. "I want to start supporting social projects, and I think you can help me decide where to begin." She looked at him, skeptical. "Since when do you care about that?" "Since I realized the world doesn't revolve around me," he replied honestly. Vicky hesitated for a moment. Despite her reluctance to trust him, the idea of doing something meaningful appealed to her. "All right," she said at last. "But I'm not doing this for you." "I wouldn't expect anything else," Billy replied with a small smile. In the days that followed, Billy and Vicky began visiting charities and community projects. He took her to shelters, rehabilitation centers, and schools in underprivileged areas. During each visit, Vicky noticed how Billy interacted differently with people. He seemed genuinely interested in hearing their stories and understanding their needs. One visit was particularly impactful. They went to a shelter for women who had experienced domestic violence. While Vicky talked with some of the residents, Billy approached a young woman holding a baby. He crouched down to her level and began asking about her story. "It's hard to trust people after what I've been through," the young woman said, holding the baby tighter. Billy nodded, his expression serious. "I understand." Vicky, observing from a distance, was surprised. She hadn't expected Billy to show such genuine empathy. On the way home, The car ride was heavy with silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Vicky sensed something was changing in Billy, though a barrier still remained, preventing her from fully believing in him. One evening, Billy decided to take a bold step. He organized a special dinner just for the two of them. The dining room was decorated with candles and flowers, and soft music played in the background. "What's this?" Vicky asked as she saw the setting. "Thank you," Billy replied, pulling out a chair for her. "Thank you for helping me over the past few days." Vicky hesitated, but eventually sat down. The dinner was unlike any they had shared before. Billy was more open, sharing stories about his childhood and how he grew up in a cold environment where emotions were seen as weakness. "I think that's why I always used money as a shield," he admitted, staring at his wine glass. "It was easier than dealing with real people." Vicky listened in silence, absorbing every word. She had never imagined Billy admitting something like this. She finally asked, "What do you want?" Billy looked up, locking eyes with her. "I want to be better. Someone you might one day respect." She stayed quiet for a long moment before replying, "That doesn't depend only on you." "I know," he said with a sigh. "But I'll keep trying." After dinner, as Billy cleared the table, Vicky returned to her studio. Vicky retrieved a small canvas she had painted over the past few days. It depicted a serene landscape with an open field and a sunset sky. "Here," she said, handing the painting to Billy. He looked at the canvas, surprised. "It's beautiful. I thought you might like it," Vicky replied with a shrug. Billy smiled, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Thank you." In the days that followed, Billy began to show small but noticeable changes in his behavior. He treated the mansion staff with more respect, listened to suggestions from his employees at the company, and dedicated more time to the social projects he and Vicky had started together. Vicky, in turn, cautiously began to lower her defenses. She knew that trusting Billy again would be a long and complicated process, but little by little, something within her started to shift. One afternoon, as they walked through the mansion's garden, Billy suddenly stopped and looked at Vicky. "I want to show you something," he said. Curious, she followed him to a small cabin at the back of the property. Inside, the cabin was filled with mementos from Billy's childhood, photos, old toys, and even drawings he had made as a child. "I've never shown this to anyone," he said as she explored the space. Vicky picked up one of the photos and saw a young Billy standing next to an elegant woman, whom she assumed was his mother. "You had a different life than I imagined," she remarked. Billy gave a melancholic smile. "My mother always said money could buy many things, but never happiness. I think it took me a long time to understand that." Vicky placed the photo back on the shelf and turned to him. "Maybe there's still time to learn." The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. As Vicky walked slowly through the mansion's garden later that evening, she reflected on the intense and unexpected moments of recent days. Though she felt something changing within herself, an immovable barrier still kept her from fully letting her guard down. That night, as she worked on a new painting in the art studio, Billy appeared at the door. He looked hesitant, something unusual for the man who always exuded confidence. "May I come in?" he asked almost timidly. Vicky looked at him for a moment before nodding. Billy stepped in, approaching the canvas she was working on. "It's beautiful," he said, referring to the landscape. "Thank you," Vicky replied, keeping her focus on the painting. Billy took a deep breath. "I need to tell you something I've never shared with anyone." Vicky set the brush down and turned to him, intrigued. "I'm listening." Billy began pacing the studio, his hands in his pockets, as though gathering courage. "When I was a kid, my mother was my only connection to the real world. My father was a cold man who believed success came before everything, even family. He taught me to be ruthless, to never show weakness." He paused, his eyes distant, lost in memories. "My mother, on the other hand, believed love and empathy mattered more than any amount of money. But she died when I was only 12. After that, my father made sure I became the man he wanted me to be, cold, calculating, and driven by numbers." Vicky listened intently, absorbing every word. There was something painfully human about the way he spoke of his past. "And now," she asked gently, "do you still think you need to be that man?" Billy shook his head slowly.
No.
"You've shown me there's more to life than I was willing to see." A long silence followed before Vicky finally spoke. "I have something to say, too." Billy looked at her curiously as Vicky lowered her gaze. "When you humiliated me in that interview years ago, it was the moment I lost all faith in myself. It broke me in ways you can't imagine." Her voice trembled, and Billy felt a crushing weight in his chest. He knew he had caused more harm than he could ever undo. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice carrying a sincerity that surprised even him. Vicky looked up at him, and for the first time, she saw a vulnerable man stripped of his usual arrogance. She knew forgiveness would be a long process, but at that moment, she decided to take the first step. "I want to believe you, Billy. But you need to understand that trust isn't rebuilt overnight." Billy nodded, his expression serious. "I know, and I'm willing to wait as long as it takes." In the days that followed, Billy threw himself even more into the social projects he and Vicky worked on together. They visited underserved communities and spoke with people who had faced challenges similar to Vicky's. With each interaction, Vicky began to see that Billy truly was changing. During one of these visits, they met a young woman named Lily, who was about to drop out of school due to financial difficulties. Moved by her story, Vicky turned to Billy. "Can we help?" she asked, determination in her eyes. Billy smiled. "We can and we will." With Billy's support, Lily received a scholarship and financial assistance. Vicky felt a warmth in her heart as she saw the joy in the young woman's eyes. It was as if, by helping her, Vicky was also healing herself a little more. Later that evening, back at the mansion, Vicky sat in the living room watching the fire crackle in the fireplace. Billy entered and sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "Today was special," he said, breaking the silence. Vicky nodded. "Yes, it was." They sat quietly for a moment before Billy spoke again. "Vicky, can I ask you something?" She looked at him, waiting. "Do you think there's still a chance for us?" Vicky felt her heart race. It was a difficult question, but she knew she had to be honest. "I don't know, Billy. I think we still have a lot to work through." Billy nodded, accepting her answer without protest. He knew that if there was any hope, he would have to keep proving to her that he was willing to change. As the days passed, life at the mansion found a new rhythm. Vicky became more involved in the social projects, and Billy continued to show small but meaningful changes in his behavior. Though the emotional distance between them began to narrow, Vicky remained hesitant to fully trust him. One sunny afternoon, Billy invited Vicky to take a walk in the garden. She hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. As they strolled among the flowers, Billy spoke about a new project, building a community center to provide education and job training for people in vulnerable situations. "I want you to lead it with me," he said, smiling encouragingly. Vicky stopped, surprised. "Me?"
Yes.
"You understand these people's needs better than anyone, and I want you to know that I trust you." She stayed silent for a moment, taking in his words. Despite a lingering shadow of doubt, Vicky couldn't ignore the warmth growing in her heart. "I'll think about it," she finally replied. Billy nodded, respecting her need for time. Later that day, while Vicky was in the art studio, she received an unexpected call. It was from Clara, an old friend from her time on the streets. Clara's voice, full of emotion, stirred memories Vicky thought she had long buried. Vicky received a call that stirred a mix of nostalgia and joy within her. Clara, an old friend from her time on the streets, was on the line. "Vicky, I heard you're doing well now, working on social projects." "I need to see you," Clara said, her voice almost breathless. Vicky arranged to meet her at a cafe downtown the next day. When she mentioned the meeting to Billy, he insisted on accompanying her. "I won't interfere, but I want to make sure you're safe," he said firmly. Vicky rolled her eyes, but agreed to let him come along. The next day, as Vicky waited for Clara at the cafe, she felt a tinge of nervousness. It had been years since they last met, and she didn't know what to expect. When Clara finally arrived, the two embraced warmly, reminiscing about the hard times they had shared. "You've changed, Vicky," Clara remarked after a while. "You seem stronger." "I'm still learning," Vicky replied with a modest smile. As they talked, Vicky noticed Billy sitting discreetly at a nearby table. Although he was there solely to ensure her safety, his presence brought her an unexpected sense of comfort. On the drive back to the mansion, Vicky broke the silence. "Thank you for bringing me here today." Billy smiled, surprised by her sudden gratitude. "There's no need to thank me." "But I want to," she insisted. "You've been different lately, and I've noticed." Billy was quiet for a moment before responding. "I just want to do the right thing, Vicky." The sincerity in his voice made Vicky's heart waver. Though she wanted to deny it, she couldn't ignore that Billy was indeed changing. However, things took a sharp turn when Oliver, the friend who had initiated the infamous bet, reappeared unexpectedly. He showed up at the mansion unannounced, a cynical smile on his face. "Billy, how's it going with your new wife?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. Vicky, who was in the garden, froze when she heard his voice. Quietly, she approached and hid behind a column to listen. "What do you want, Oliver?" Billy asked, clearly irritated. "Oh, I'm just curious. After all, the bet's almost up, isn't it? You must be looking forward to collecting your $2 million. Vicky felt a chill run through her. Although she already knew about the bet, hearing Oliver speak about it so carelessly reopened old wounds she was trying to heal. "The bet doesn't matter anymore," Billy replied firmly. "I canceled it." Oliver laughed, incredulous. "Canceled? You've got to be kidding." "I'm not," Billy said, his tone resolute. "I don't need the money, and I definitely don't need the bet." Oliver looked at him, surprised. "So, you're really falling for her?" Billy didn't respond, but his expression said it all. Vicky stepped out from her hiding spot, her heart torn between anger and confusion. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice trembling. Billy turned, startled to see her. "Vicky, I can explain." "I don't want explanations, Billy. I want the truth," she shouted, tears filling her eyes. Oliver, sensing the tension, stepped back awkwardly. "I think I'll leave you two to sort this out." As Oliver left, Billy tried to approach Vicky, but she backed away. "Did you cancel the bet?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Yes, I did." "Why?" Billy took a deep breath. "Because you're more important than any stupid challenge." Vicky stood silent, her emotions in turmoil. She wanted to believe him, but the fear of being hurt again was overwhelming. "I don't know if I can trust you, Billy." "Not after all this," she finally said. "Then don't trust me," he replied, his tone calm yet firm. "Just watch. Let my actions prove what my words can't." Vicky looked at him, trying to decipher the sincerity in his eyes. Though doubts lingered, something inside her told her he was being truthful. The days following their confrontation were tense. Vicky spent hours in the studio, sorting through her thoughts, while Billy remained determined to prove his intentions were genuine. Despite the emotional distance, it was impossible to ignore the visible transformation in Billy. One morning, Vicky sat on the terrace with a cup of tea, watching the trees sway gently in the breeze. Her restless mind wandered between painful memories of the past and recent moments of genuine connection with Billy. She knew she had to make a decision soon, but the fear of trusting again left her paralyzed. Billy appeared in the doorway, hesitant. He held a folder in his hands, his expression serious, but lacking the arrogance she once associated with him. "May I join you?" he asked, respecting the space she so deeply valued. Vicky nodded, and Billy sat at the table, placing the folder between them. "I brought something for you," he said, opening the folder and carefully taking out a set of documents. "This is proof that I ended the bet. There's no longer any connection between me and Oliver." Vicky picked up the papers and read them carefully. The signatures and dates confirmed that Billy had indeed returned the money from the bet and had even donated a significant amount to charity. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, looking up at him. "Because I want you to know I'm being honest. I don't expect you to trust me right away, but I want you to see that I'm trying to be a different man." Vicky set the papers aside and turned her gaze back to the horizon. She knew Billy was making an effort, but the wound from his betrayal still ached. "You want to be different, but that doesn't change what happened," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It doesn't," Billy admitted, leaning forward slightly. "But I want you to know I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." The silence between them was heavy with unspoken emotions. Vicky knew she would eventually have to confront her feelings about Billy. Billy's question. She looked into his eyes, searching for any trace of the man who had once hurt her so deeply. But all she saw was sincerity and vulnerability, a man who had transformed in ways she hadn't thought possible. "You have," she admitted softly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within her. "But trust isn't something that can be fully rebuilt overnight. It's going to take time." Billy nodded, his expression calm but hopeful. "I understand, and I'm willing to wait as long as it takes. I don't just want your forgiveness, Vicky. I want your trust, your partnership, and someday your love." The vulnerability in his voice brought a lump to Vicky's throat. For so long, she had doubted his intentions, but now, standing before him in the serenity of the garden, she could feel the sincerity radiating from him. The following weeks brought even more changes. Billy continued to dedicate himself to the social projects they had started, but now his actions felt less like an attempt to prove himself and more like an intrinsic part of who he was becoming. Vicky, too, began to open her heart, not completely, but enough to let glimpses of hope and warmth seep through the cracks. One evening, while they were hosting a fundraiser for a new community center, Vicky stood at the edge of the room, watching Billy interact with donors and volunteers. He was charming yet genuine, speaking passionately about the impact their projects were making. It was a far cry from the cold, calculating man she had first met. As the night wore on, Billy approached her, his smile warm but tinged with a hint of nervousness. "Can we step outside for a moment?" he asked. Curious, Vicky agreed, and together they walked to the garden. The moon cast a soft glow over the flowers, and the air was cool and still. Billy stopped near the same stone bench where they had spoken weeks before. "Vicky," he began, his voice steady but laced with emotion, "you've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. I didn't just learn how to care for others because of you. I learned how to care for myself. And I want to keep growing, not just for me, but for us." Vicky's heart pounded as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Opening it, he revealed a simple yet elegant ring, its design reminiscent of a butterfly in flight. "I'm not asking for an answer today," he said gently, "but I want you to know that I'm serious about building a future with you. When you're ready, if you're ready, I'll be here." Tears welled up in Vicky's eyes as she looked at him. The walls she had built around her heart were crumbling faster now, replaced by a cautious but undeniable hope. She didn't say anything, but her hand reached out to touch his, and in that simple gesture, Billy felt the answer he was waiting for. For the first time in years, both of them felt like they were standing at the beginning of something new, a life rebuilt on trust, love, and the belief that even the most broken of hearts could heal. She met his gaze, noticing the hope and vulnerability in his eyes. "You've changed, Billy," she admitted. "And yes, you're earning my trust back." Billy smiled, but there was something else he needed to say. Taking a deep breath, he lowered himself to one knee and pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. Vicky gasped in surprise as Billy opened the box to reveal a simple yet elegant diamond ring. "Vicky, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because of a contract, but because of love." His words hung in the air, and Vicky felt tears well up in her eyes. For a moment, she was speechless, her heart racing. Finally, she smiled and nodded. "Yes, Billy, I will." Billy slipped the ring onto her finger, and they embraced under the shade of the tree. It was a simple yet profoundly meaningful moment, marking the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. A few weeks later, their wedding took place in an intimate ceremony in the mansion's garden. Only a few close friends and partners from their social projects were present, but the love and joy in the air were undeniable. Vicky wore a delicate lace dress that made her look almost ethereal, while Billy, in a sharp suit, couldn't take his eyes off her. During their vows, Billy held Vicky's hands tightly, his voice filled with emotion. "Vicky, you've taught me the true meaning of love, patience, and redemption. I promise to stand by your side through every moment, good or bad, and dedicate my life to making you happy." With tears in her eyes, Vicky responded, "Billy, you've shown me that people can change and that love can grow even in the most unlikely circumstances. I promise to love you and walk by your side as we build our future together." Applause and smiles followed their kiss, sealing their commitment to one another. For the first time, Vicky felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. Their first year of marriage was full of challenges, but also moments of joy and growth. Together, Vicky and Billy worked to expand their social projects, helping hundreds of people rebuild their lives. Their relationship deepened, rooted in trust and genuine love. One morning, while they were in the kitchen preparing breakfast together, Vicky turned to Billy with a shy smile. "I have some news for you," she said, her eyes sparkling. Curious, Billy stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "What is it?" "We're going to have a baby," Vicky revealed, her voice filled with emotion. For a moment, Billy was speechless. Then, a radiant smile lit up his face. He stepped closer and embraced her tightly. "This is wonderful, Vicky," he exclaimed, his voice brimming with excitement. The news brought even more joy to their lives. The following months were spent preparing the baby's room and planning for their future as a family. The day Grace was born was one of the most emotional moments of their lives. When they finally held their daughter in their arms, both felt an instant connection, as if all the challenges of the past had prepared them for that moment. "She's perfect," Vicky whispered, tears in her eyes. "Just like her mother," Billy replied, gently stroking Grace's head. Grace's arrival further strengthened their bond. The mansion, once marked by coldness and formality, became a warm and loving home. The following years were filled with achievements. The community center that Billy and Vicky founded became a beacon of hope, helping thousands of people find new opportunities. Vicky continued painting, using her art to raise funds for social projects, while Billy became a mentor to young entrepreneurs aiming to make a difference. Grace grew up surrounded by love, her laughter filling the house with joy. Billy and Vicky, now partners in every sense of the word, looked to the future with hope and gratitude. One evening, as they watched Grace sleep, Billy held Vicky's hand and whispered, "You've changed my life in ways I never imagined." Vicky smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "And you've shown me that love can bloom in the most unexpected places." Together, they looked ahead, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would always stand by each other, united by the love that had transformed them.